Public monuments can have many purposes for telling a story, sending a message, even helping us punctuate a photographic pilgrimage with a selfie. A discussion about these monuments recently took place in Boston in a series of events during restoration work on one of the city's most famous monuments, honoring the 54th Regiment. To share some of the ongoing conversation are the Executive Director of the Friends of the Public Garden, Liz Visa, and the Director of Education and Interpretation at the Museum of African American History in Boston, Lamerche Frazier. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you.
I want to start with Liz. Supply the context here, the work on the monument and the conversation.
Great, sure, thanks. So the Friends of the Public Garden has worked for many, many years with the city to care for the three downtown parks, the Boston Common, Public Garden, and Commonwealth Avenue Mall, including 42 pieces of public art within the three parks. This is arguably the most important monument in our three parks and one of the most important monuments in the country. And in 1981, the Friends raised money. Our first major campaign to restore a monument was to restore the Shaw. It was in horrible shape, the victim of vandalism, corrosion, and neglect. And ever since then, we've cared for that monument. We also back then added the names of the 54th Regiment who fell at the famous battle that took place in
Fort Wagner.
Fort Wagner, yeah. So we've been caring for it. But despite regular care, water has infiltrated into the monument and actually into the core. The foundation underneath the bronze is brick, and when we did recent work with our conservator in 2015, we found out that foundation was not as firm as it should be, and it makes it vulnerable to seismic events. So we decided to do a fundamental reconstruction of the monument, working with the National Park Service and the City of Boston. $2.8 million, and the feds are bringing a half of that money to the table, which is really exciting. So it means taking the monument apart from the plaza level up, bringing the stone and the bronze off-site, rebuilding the foundation under the bronze, waterproofing and shoring up the plaza, and then bringing everything back. Will take up to 6 months. We hope to start in the spring. I will not talk about the government shutdown, which is impacting our work and our schedule, but we didn't want to just do that work. We realized that work allowed us to create a platform for dialogue, to have that dialogue about what does this monument tell us? What are the issues that it brings forth? How do people need to understand this monument better? And the whole question about race and justice and equality that it tells and that continues to need to be told and to be confronted today. So that gave rise to a fourth partner, the Museum of African American History, which is very exciting to have a series of events to have that dialogue. And last week was a very exciting part of that series.
Lamerche Frazier, we don't just think this is a plain old Civil War monument in Boston, because there are lots of those, but this is a time when Civil War monuments, they're not as generic anymore. I mean, they're controversial. So what does that have to do with the conversation here?
I think this monument is very special in that it doesn't suffer the criticism that others have in the country, because it raises the bar of democratic principles in America. It raises the bar of equity, because the Shaw Monument represents the 54th Regiment, the first regiment raised in the North of black soldiers recruited in 1863. The idea that was taken to Abraham Lincoln, president at the time, was to include them in the Emancipation Proclamation as this first regiment raised. It celebrates that memory. It, in fact, after their first battle, which was a hard battle, which caused the loss of life of their leader, Colonel Robert Shaw, we find that Joshua Bowdoin, who was a freeborn African-American man who was a caterer in Boston and had worked for the Shaw family, initially he was the one who said, aha, we must have a memorial to the 54th. Frederick Douglass's two sons fought in this regiment. There were many recruiters, and 1,200 men are represented in this regiment who come from different points, not only Massachusetts, but other places. And we think about how this monument, unlike many of the other monuments, raises the question, who will fight for the end of slavery? And they wanted to take the first blow. So in that conversation, when we talk about dismantling monuments, we're not talking about the Shaw Monument. In the representation of the glory and the valor and the honor of those men, it stands in the American landscape extremely strong to make the presence of well-crafted faces of African American men who fought at Fort Wagner. And I think it is fair to say that Saint-Gaudens, in his making this a very special monument, was called on by the Shaw family to not just make it a one-man lone on a horse with a sword, but to represent a regiment that fought together.
Well, another context for this one occurs to me is that even before this was put up, there was an earlier attempt to honor black soldiers in the South, and it was thwarted.
Yes, and it was very unlikely that that was going to happen on Morris Island, and so the African American men who were trying to get a monument raised immediately on Morris Island were dwarfed in their campaign. Joshua Bowdoin was smart. He initially put in his own $500, and then he was asked by Charles Sumner in Boston.
The abolitionist senator.
Yes, the abolitionist senator, to hold off until after the war. And so it begins in 1865, the recruitment of the artists to vet, and finally Saint-Gaudens is chosen. He is the one awarded, and he takes it very seriously. It takes him 14 years, longer than he has expected, to get this done. But he uses actual African American men in his studio. He invites them into his studio in New York and fashions this well-rendered monument, I would say.
Liz, every day people come to the city from around the world, and they're provoked when they look at this monument. But what about the people at the event recently? And some of them were from far outside of Boston as well.
They were.
What did they have to say?
It was wonderful because we brought together the voice of activism in Deray Mckesson, who is the leader of the Black Lives Matter movement, the voice of art history. Renee Ader is an art historian, and really particularly her focus has been about the art of slavery, monuments in their context, what the meanings of monuments are, what voices are told and what voices are not told. And then Sheffield Hale, who is the president and CEO of the Atlanta History Center. So here you have a history center in Georgia where it's illegal to take down a Confederate monument. So there was a lot of conversation about removal of monuments, and he has had to deal with contextualizing monuments. So they had a very dynamic conversation and debate at some points about whether monuments should be taken down or not, what voices are allowed to be told, what stories are allowed to be told, and voices allowed to be heard in monuments and whatnot. It was wonderful to hear from Deray talking about the activist voice and perspective. For instance, in Montgomery, Alabama, it's not a monument per se, but it's meaning that the streets of Commerce and Market Street in Montgomery, Alabama are where slaves were driven down to be sold. So excavating the meaning of monuments, and what was the purpose of monuments, the Confederate monuments put up. The Daughters of the American Confederacy were very clever about putting them on public property, which made it harder for them to be taken down, and they were meant to intimidate. They were meant to send a message. So it was a very dynamic, there were about 500 people that came. It was a very integrated audience, which was exciting, and there was a lot of buzz and conversation during and after that. Derek Jackson was the moderator, and a very lively conversation.
This has been News. We're talking with Liz Visa from the Friends of the Public Garden and Lamertie Frazier from the Museum of African American History. Lamertie, speaking of messages about this monument honoring the 54th, there's this wordage in Latin, and he gave up everything to serve the Republic. It's in the singular, even though it should be plural. But what I also see here, looking at this sculpture, I see people in the regiment taking initiative, trying to change a narrative. What's the history there?
I think when Saint-Gaudens fashioned the monument, he was thinking about men who were forward-going, forward-thinking, being led by a drummer boy, who we have celebrated as a carte de visite in our collection, has that drummer boy, Henry Monroe, who represents the youth. He was actually only 13 years old. He enlisted as if he was 16. But this idea that people come to this monument and they see men of might and purpose, represented very well here. They have all of their accoutrements of war, the tack, the canteen. It's so well rendered, and the conformation of the horses even, you're able to see it. So it has a conversation with you even if you don't know the story. It is present. It is materialized. It is a piece to be reckoned with. And I see people, I lead people on tour to this monument because it is the beginning of our Black Heritage Trail that's owned by the Museum of African American History that represents a trail of abolition through Beacon Hill. And where this sits, it can't help but get attention. It is across the street from the State House. And so people are enamored with its presence. There are people who I've been sitting there sometimes just noticing, where are people from? Do they have language that helps them to describe this in English? Many of them may not be English speakers, but they know that this is about victory. They know it's about triumph. So I think the materialization that happens here sets a conversation for anyone around the world who knows about fighting for freedom.
And you know, it's interesting because it's not enough a lot of times for people to see this as a high quality digital representation where they live. But when our conservator works on these monuments, people come from all over. When people come from Ohio on a pilgrimage to see this monument, sometimes he has to unveil it, open things up when he's got it closed up and working because he realizes it's really important for them to be able to see this. And when we had a centennial celebration in 1997, Colin Powell came up and spoke, and he talked about standing on the shoulders of these men. If it weren't for these men behind me, I would not be here with you today.
Mm-hmm. We should finally mention if people want to find out more information or see what's coming up next. Liz and Lamerty, anything you want to say about what they can do there?
Yeah, right. We have a website, and I have to get a link for you and let you know what that link is. But if you go on our website, you can find your way to the web page that we share together. The next event will be launching the project with the celebration on site. We're going to be having a rededication in the fall when it's complete. We're showing Glory on the Common in the summer. It'll be sometime in August. Because a lot of people in this generation don't know that movie. It's back from the 80s, so it'll be great to show that movie.
And the museum has a website too, right?
Yes, we do. And we also have social media send-outs that highlight the 54th Regiment, Throwback Thursdays, and some of the quotes from the men and their letters back from Fort Wagner to us, and tidbits and details that Governor Andrew was contributing to this onslaught that they were able to do when they went to South Carolina, and how he contributed to that effort. I'd like to invite people to come to www.maah.org.
Great, thank you both. Lamerty Frazier and Liz Visa.